dealing with the NRA, I want to bring in U.S. Congressman Matt Gaetz, formerly a member of the Florida House of Representatives, now representing the 1st District in Florida in the United States Congress. Congressman, thank you very much for being here.
Good to be on, Joy.
So, and I'm going to have the panel hold on just a second. I just want to talk to you because we just saw yesterday the response of the Florida legislature, where you used to serve, attempting to respond to the Parkland massacre in some meaningful way. There is a really amazing story that I highly recommend people read. It's in the New Yorker. It talks about the state of Florida and how it became a gun haven. And it opens with a story by a man called Reid, and he's a Democratic member of the Florida House. And he's talking about getting a call from his wife. He actually went to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. He gets a call from his wife. Their kids go to school near that school, and just the harrowing feeling of being a parent, not sure what's happening with your kids, and then going to Tallahassee and being confronted by parents. And Reid shakes hands with a guy named Dan Daly in this story, young city commissioner in Coral Springs. I was talking to one of the Douglas students, Daly said. His only words to me were, do something. I had to tell him I legally can't do anything because the governor could take my job away if I tried. Moskowitz turned to me. That's the legacy of Marion Hammer, he said. And what he was referring to is a law that Marion Hammer, who's the lobbyist in Florida, worked to enact in 2011 during Governor Rick Scott's first year in office. It's a statute that punishes local officials who attempt to establish gun regulations stricter than those imposed at the state level. Officials can be fined thousands of dollars and removed from office. You backed that bill.
I wrote
You
it.
pushed that. Well, Marion Hammer, it seems, wrote it, and you added your name to it. Why shouldn't a local municipality be able to write their own gun laws?
Because in the state of Florida, we don't want people to inadvertently become criminals because they happen to go from one municipality or one county to another. We have 67 counties and hundreds of municipalities, and we feel that whatever the gun laws are, they ought to exist equally over the state and apply to all Floridians the same way. Reid Moskowitz is one of my heroes in politics. He actually works in a bipartisan way to try to find real solutions, and I'm incredibly proud that Reid Moskowitz and actually Dan Daly have worked to help create a system where our mental health laws in the screening of people will be better, so they won't return home to their arsenals. So I'm proud of the work of the Florida legislature to reform our mental health process, where when someone is deemed a threat, when they are in the custody of law enforcement or a mental health facility, we're going to use that time more effectively so that we can determine whether or not they should return home to guns. And in many cases, we ought to have power in the hands of local law enforcement with due process to ensure that we've got safer communities, but nothing in my 2011 law that would stop local communities from creating gun-free zones in any way would impair that important work. And I would suggest to you that in Florida, the last mass shootings we have had occurred not in areas where we allow firearms, but in gun-free zones. And when you put up a sign in front of schools that say this is a gun-free zone, I fear, unfortunately, you make some of the people at that school a target, and I think we can correct that at the state level.
All right, I want to unpack a couple of things that you talked about. You talked about local control. But your bill essentially says that the local elected officials that people work to elect have no power. They essentially are not allowed to even determine whether or not people are allowed, for instance, to shoot guns in local parks. The NRA sued the mayor of Tallahassee over that. Interestingly enough, this sort of idea that every place in Florida should be the Wild West, going back to the 1880s, are you aware that, in the 1880s, in places like Tombstone, Arizona, the laws were incredibly strict? Tombstone, Arizona had far stricter gun control laws than it does today. The American West's most infamous gun battle, Wyatt Earp was attempting to essentially enforce local gun ordinances. In these Wild West towns, some of the first laws that they enacted at the local level were to restrict the carrying of firearms in local city limits. So this country has a long history of local municipalities making their own decisions about gun laws. And in fact, the homicide rate in those places in the Wild West in the 1880s, where they had strict gun laws, where you couldn't carry a gun into Tombstone, Arizona, in these municipalities, they actually had much lower rates of homicides. Why is it that now, in the modern era, local municipalities should have no right to make their own laws?
Well, we've come a long way since the 1880s, and we've got even more.
Rates.
Some of the highest homicide rates occur in some of the local municipalities, just gun laws, like Chicago, like Detroit. So I don't think you can draw a comparison between local enhanced gun control and improved public safety. There's no evidence of that.
It's interesting. Have you been to Chicago? Have you lived in Chicago?
I've been there. I've not lived there.
When you were in Chicago,
hold
on a second. Last time you were in Chicago, were you accosted? Did crime occur against you? Because it's interesting that Republicans seem to have quite an obsession with Chicago. You represent Florida. So let's talk about Florida.
Sure. So in Florida, we don't want a patchwork of ordinances and laws in Florida that would have someone, just because they inadvertently cross a municipal line or cross a county line with maybe a rifle locked in the back of their trunk, that could be illegal in some municipality and legal in another.
Or shooting a gun in a park, which you guys have said.
No, that's already a crime. That's not true.
No,
that's
I will play you
false.
Andrew Gillum,
that's unlawful discharge. That's reckless discharge of a gun.
Sued by the NRA because they wanted to ban guns in the park. But let's go on.
There's a difference between having a gun in a park and shooting a gun in a park, and you conflated those.
Well, I'm quite sure that parents who have their kids playing in the park would prefer not to have somebody walking around with an AR-15 there. Let's go back to the bill that you sponsored.
Then they could vote to change state law.
They've tried, but your party won't let them because the NRA says no. I want to go back to your sponsorship of the bill. In my district, people who share the values of the NRA well exceed half of my district. Look, there are a number of places in Florida where people really do cherish the Second Amendment. How many members does the NRA have in Florida?
I think over 1 million.
300,000 by their own count. How many people live in Florida?
20 million.
20 million. So 300,000 people in Florida are ruling over and making laws for 20 million people.
But it's not just the membership of the NRA. There's countless people beyond just dues-paying members of the NRA who share the goals and values of the NRA to defend the Second Amendment, and that's the lever.
Not according to the polling. The polling says the overwhelming majority of people want stricter gun laws. I want to go right back for a moment to what things you've said. I just want to stick with you for just a moment. In this same New Yorker article, it talks the statute that you pushed that punishes local officials who try to pass gun laws stricter than state gun laws. Sponsor of the bill was Matt Gaetz, at the time a 28-year-old Republican state representative. That's the sequence of how each piece is done. Representative Dennis Baxley, a close ally of Marion Hammer, told me. On bills that he sponsors, she works on it with the analyst. That's Marion Hammer. Then I take it over and file it. I'm not picky on the details. She essentially does, she essentially writes the bills. One more quote here, and this is describing Marion Hammer's power and influence. Gaetz says that one of Ms. Hammer's emails packs more political punch than 100,000 TV buys from any special interest in the state. Hammer demonstrates a keen understanding of group identity. She and her followers are defending a way of life that is under threat, according to her. When a public official breaks ranks, Hammer exposes his treacherous actions and traitorous nature. She then invites her supporters to contact the official. Tell them how you feel, she says. Do it today. You also have said that she uses supercharged language, provocative language. She keeps her followers apprised of who's been loyal to the Second Amendment and who's committed unforgivable betrayals. This is your quote. If you're with Marion 95% of the time, you're a damn traitor. If you're with Marion 95% of the time rather than 100%, you're a damn traitor. If I elect you as a politician, as an elected official, why is it that you are more beholden to Marion Hammer and obedient to her than you are to your constituents?
Well, I'm not. I've disagreed with Marion Hammer plenty of times. And
can you name
she's
one?
Had a different. Sure. In the actual bill that you referenced, the preemption bill, I wanted stronger language to stop any type of backyard shooting range.
Did you get
Marion it? I did. Marion wasn't comfortable with the language I selected. I told her that was the deal. If I was going to be the sponsor of the bill, I wanted to have strong protections for discharge of firearms rather than just possession of those firearms. And ultimately, that was the way the bill was drafted and ultimately enacted into law. So there are plenty of circumstances where special interest groups all over the political spectrum put in input because they want to influence legislation. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not.
She's successful almost all of the time. I want to do one more quote here.
That's not true.
One more quote from you. One more quote from you. No, she is. She's the most successful gun lobbyist in the country.
She is the most successful gun lobbyist in the country, but she doesn't get her way every time. I'll give you an example. She's been fighting to end gun-free zones at schools for nearly a decade, and she's been unsuccessful at that endeavor. safer. And I think if we had highly qualified, highly trained people that
she
were
wants
on
more
schools,
guns. Of course she does. She always does. Now let's go back to something your dad.
Right,
Your
but it
dad
could
was
help
also
people.
right. She wants more guns. Of course she does. She's lobbying
if
for
they
the gun
make people
industry.
safer, look,
she
if they're
wants
in the
more
hands
guns,
of people
right.
who are qualified to protect children,
There is not
imagine
a
if the
statistic on
coach
earth
who
that
was a
shows that
hero
more
at Parkland.
guns. Are guns allowed to be carried where you work in Congress?
I think they should be, frankly. But look,
you
I
want
have to
guns
walk
in the
through...
well of Congress?
Absolutely.
Why don't you pass that law then? You all, or the
It
Republicans,
was my
or the majority.
first question.
Pass
When
it.
I was here for orientation, it was my first question of the folks
You want to
that
have
briefed
guns
us.
in the well of Congress, in the gallery of Congress?
Yeah, you know what? I also
really?
think we should be able to bring them to baseball practice because
How about
when
courthouses?
Courthouses, I think that there are some circumstances in courthouses where you would not want to have guns in a particular
environment.
environment.
No, but why not?
Well, because at courthouses you already have such strong security that there's a way to neutralize the
strong
threat,
security in
unlike at a
Congress.
school. Not at schools. At schools
There's
you
strong
sometimes
security
have...
at Congress. Why do you want guns in Congress but not courthouses?
In Congress, you have over 500 targets that are members. In
but in
courthouses,
schools,
you
you have
typically
hundreds of
fewer
targets
people.
too, and
right,
they're
and that's why we need more guns in schools. That's why we need. Yeah, we do. We need a force multiplier for the deputies and school resource officers in the form of highly qualified, highly trained
people. And how
people,
would SWAT
former
know who
military.
was the bad guy and who was the good guy if everyone's carrying?
You can have a reporting system where school superintendents work with sheriffs to designate marshals, to have them go through law enforcement training. We're talking about former military, former law enforcement, and they can be a force multiplier. And you know what?
Bad guys know that multiplier work at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas when you had an armed guard outside. You had a guy with a gun.
It wasn't a force multiplier. It was precisely the opposite of a force multiplier. It was one dude with a gun who didn't go inside.
So you
imagine if the
more
cop
people
who laid
inside
his
with
life,
guns. Okay.
Imagine if the
hold on a
coach
second.
who laid his life down and had the ability to put that shooter down.
Well,
we
everyone
could have
would be
saved
shooting.
dozens of lives.
And what happens if a teacher inadvertently shoots a student?
Well, look, we had some people.
That's okay with you?
Absolutely shooting students. We had people
what if
intentionally
a teacher
shooting
inadvertently shoots a student in the crossfire?
But you are making up a hypothetical that didn't exist rather than dealing with the fact pattern
I'm making up a
before
hypothetical that could happen if you have your way and everyone's armed in the school.
Look,
Let's have one more quote from Mayor.
Your premise has to be an accident.
You want to have
these are not accidents.
crossfire
These are
between
intentional
teachers
acts.
and shooters, and you think
that
that's
is ridiculous.
an acceptable
if you
risk?
put guns in
Let
the
me
forms
ask Frank
of highly
Figluzzi that
qualified
question.
people,
Okay,
they'll
maybe
be
I'm
able to
not
help.
qualified. Let's ask Frank Figluzzi. I'm going to bring him in here. Frank Figluzzi, you are a person who has worked in closer to this field than I have, certainly. Do you think it's a good idea to have armed teachers shooting it out with mass shooters in schools?
I think it's a convenient, nice-sounding Band-Aid approach that actually has no practicality and no data to defend it. So, again, we know that the weapon of choice in these mass shootings over and over again is an assault rifle. Putting a handgun in the hands of a teacher does not counter the assault rifle. Putting it even in police officers' hands, as we had multiple deputies respond in Parkland, still didn't work. So we'd be looking at an arms race inside the classroom, where now we have to upgrade to assault rifles for teachers or shotguns for teachers. It simply doesn't work from a law enforcement experience background.
Do you have a law enforcement experience background, Mr. Gaetz?
Well, I was chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee, and I certainly don't have the same.
Background?
It's not, but if you look at the Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd, he's got an incredible law enforcement background in Tallahassee, saying that his law enforcement officers will be safer if they can rely on highly qualified people in classrooms that have the ability to put down an active shooter. We don't have that now, and it puts our students at risk.
So we'll just have a shooting gallery in the schools. Let's have State Representative Robert Asensio, who's in the Florida House, and he actually does have a law enforcement background. He was a police officer. And this is his thought on the idea of having armed teachers in classrooms.
I've been involved in shootouts, and I've seen children die as a result of gun violence. Now think back to your 8th grade English teacher, or 10th grade art teacher. Could you have trusted them not to panic and do the right thing? Do not arm your teachers. Fund appropriately public education. Fund mental health. Do ban weapons of war.
Now, Congressman, that is an elected official with a law enforcement background. Do you know more than he does?
it's hyperbole because he's saying give every art teacher a gun. That's not our argument. He's responding to an argument we're not making.
What is your
I'm
argument?
not talking
You want to
about
give
every
just
teacher.
the math teachers or what?
Absolutely not. I want to find the personnel on campus who have law enforcement training, who have military training. If we trusted someone to carry a rifle or carry a weapon in Fallujah to go fight for our freedom and our liberty and our interests there, I think we could count on them to carry it in a middle school or a high school where they would be able to put down an active shooter. So the notion of massively arming teachers is not what we're fighting for.
I don't think we want our schools to be equivalent of Fallujah. I think
but that's what you have now. Joy, that's your problem. Right now, children are dying and they're totally defenseless.
Between a teacher
and right now, the only one firing
shooter
is the bad guy. I want someone firing other than the bad guy.
And a mass shooter to shoot it out in the school. Frank Figluzzi, your thoughts?
That's ludicrous.
That's what you're saying.
Look, the combat reference is not helpful here because they carried fully automatic weapons like Colt M4s. Are you suggesting we take those military veterans and arm them with Colt M4s in our school, and then have police respond? How do the police respond when everyone's armed and now you've got a crossfire situation and you don't know who the bad guy is?
Well,
explain
I asked
how
that
that
question.
Works.
Sure, I asked that question of Sheriff John Rutherford, who serves with me on the Judiciary Committee in Congress. He said if you have good coordination between school superintendents and local sheriff's office, you know where your assets are in place. You can have rapid response communication, you can quarter off areas, and you can actually have a strategic approach to an active shooter situation instead of what we had in Parkland, which was one school resource officer scared for his life, waiting outside, refusing to go in.
Again,
if you've got a force multiplier, you've got a better chance to win.
What you're saying here is that you acknowledge that you had a trained law enforcement officer outside of the Parkland school, outside of Marjory Stoneman Douglas, and that person failed to act. That person had probably a reasonable human fear of running inside where there was assault weapons fire. But a teacher with 25, 30, 100 hours of training is going to be able to outdo that police officer. Does that even sound logical to you?
It certainly sounds logical that you have a better chance the more people you have that are trying to neutralize your active shooter. You would put us in a situation where there's no one that can neutralize the active shooter. That if someone acquires a gun through a straw man purchase or illegally or from overseas, they could come into a school and know that there is no one there that can fight back against them.
Have you ever taken live fire, sir?
Sure. I've not taken live fire. I've shot. No.
Okay. So you've never been in a situation where someone is shooting at you, right?
Correct.
But you are interpreting that in your expertise, as somebody who's never been in law enforcement and never had anyone shoot at you, that a teacher should be equipped to fire back at a mass shooter who's prepared to die, who has acquired a weapon that is just below an M16, the Armalite rifle, which was created for the military, the company that created it, and then sold to Colt, and then they created the M16. It's just below an M16. You've never experienced that live fire, but you say a teacher should return fire against a mass shooter who's prepared to die.
Well, I sure as hell don't think they should be
to say
defenseless.
that?
They shouldn't be defenseless. When I talk to my colleagues who were shot at baseball practice, every last one of them wished that they had an opportunity to respond in some way, because if Steve Scalise had missed practice that day, I would have had dozens of friends and colleagues dead because they would have been cornered.
Frank Figluzzi, you've actually been in situations that none of us really can relate to. The people who were at that baseball practice or in school, what would be your guess as to what the response would be if a mass shooter who is firing 100 rounds every 30 seconds is firing at them? What do you think that they would have done if those congressmen had been armed? Because, by the way, there were armed people in Las Vegas when that shooter began spraying the crowd with gunfire. And the armed people there, you know what they did? They ducked. They hid. But anyway, I'm going to let Frank Figluzzi have the last word because you've actually got expertise.
Well, couple things. One is let's remember how thankfully that softball baseball practice tragedy ended. It ended because of trained U.S. Capitol police officers who knew what they were doing instead of engaging in a crossfire with other members of Congress trying to shoot at each other. But I want to talk about just the last word here. This debate that we've just engaged in for an extended period of time isn't really about guns in classrooms. It's really an NRA strategy to get us distracted from the two issues that have to be addressed: assault assault weapons and mental health. Anything other than those two issues, arming teachers, bump stocks, it's a distraction from the two issues that the NRA doesn't want us talking about.
We agree on mental health. We absolutely agree on that, and I'm proud of my colleagues in Florida for working on it.
I will just say, as somebody you know, who has lived in, I lived in Florida for 14 years. You know, had two of my kids were born there. I think that your constituents want you to be obedient to their wishes and not wishes of the NRA. It's just something. It's just something to think about.
Well, and sometimes they're very similar.
We'll